Hello and welcome back, and it's another Before You Buy, and today I want to talk about the subject of memory upgrades for your NAS. Lots of you, either on day 1 or day 1000, look at your network attached storage device, look at the specifications and go, ooh, I can upgrade the memory on that, and you think, oh, should I upgrade the memory? How much memory should I upgrade to? Should I go official or unofficial? Memory on a NAS, what is it for? What do I need more for? Can I get away with less? And ultimately, should you upgrade in any shape or form within the lifespan of your product? So today we're going to talk about memory upgrades. We're going to talk about what they do, what they don't do, which is really important because a number of people buy memory upgrades and see no improvement at all. And ultimately, the big key factors when you should upgrade. So first and foremost, what does memory do inside your NAS? Well, obviously in conjunction, just like a computer with the CPU inside, these are kind of the raw materials that your system works with. Everything else afterwards is kind of means rather than ends. So when you're bunging in hard drives, when you're connecting 10 GB, anything like that, it always comes down to how well the CPU and the memory can support everything going on. So the first thing that memory inside your NAS will likely do is the services. These are everything from simple file transmissions to the handling of different users to any kind of background low-level service that you're not even seeing. The more memory you've got inside a device, a lot of the time those services will run better, because even when you're running a big application like Plex Media Server or virtual machines, you always need to have a reserve area of memory for the system itself, and a lot of that is stuff that you can't even see. The background processes there. Just going into any task manager on your NAS will show you some of the frankly inscrutable named processes in the background and how many megs, or in some cases gigabytes, of memory they are consuming. Now, applications is another one. The applications you use on a NAS, even the smallest teeny tiny, even a DLNA media server, which arguably in the grand scheme of things is actually an incredibly low level software service, these applications actually do consume a notable amount of memory. And when you do buy NAS, some of these more affordable solutions that have 1 gig of memory, which all too often cannot be upgraded, that 1 gig of memory, generally you're going to lose a third of that to the system processes early doors. And then the software you add on top, little by little, 50, 100 megs will be consumed by these services. And obviously more aggressive services, these are the ones that can consume the most memory. Now, another area of memory that's often overlooked on a system in terms of the quantity not only being used, but how much you should aspire to have, is file transfers. I know it sounds really strange, but just interacting with a NAS, transferring files back and forth, will consume memory. A lot of that is because you have some systems that's dealing with more graphical memory. Sometimes you're using more power efficient CPUs and those ARM based CPUs. And again, these are V7 and V8, be they 64-bit, 32-bit, etc. Memory plays a part there, particularly 10 GBE transfers. Any system where you're utilizing 10 GBE, you will find that the memory gets pretty hammered. Same goes for Thunderbolt NASs as well. If you look at any Thunderbolt NAS, they never arrive with less than 8 gig. And when they do, you see little caveats in the performance threshold. Same goes for 10 GBE, that they'll go, oh, this thing can hit 1,000 megs. Mwah. Make sure you've got at least 8 gig of memory. And it's, again, memory and file transfers is a very, very big deal. Now, another, and the most obvious area when it comes to memory upgrades, and again, all of these little modules I've got here on the table, we've got Kingston, we've got Crucial, we've got Time Tech, we've got Samsung, we've got Synology's own, we've got all of these different memory modules here. Generally, all of them, when it comes to NAS, are championed in the utilization of virtual machines. These are virtual equivalents to the physical PC you have. You must know about virtual machines. If you don't, it's basically a computer that you can interact with in a portal interface like a terminal, but most of the physicality of it is virtually living on software inside a system, with the system hardware resources inside a NAS being partitioned towards stuff. With virtual machines, you generally have to give them a pre-designated block of memory. So you'll run a virtual machine either within the NAS's own software virtualization station, a Synology Virtual Machine Manager, and then you go, I'm going to give it 1 gig, 2 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig of memory. Now, when the virtual machine is running, Although there are provisions for memory sharing around in the system, for a stable VM, it is recommended to block provision that memory. Go, yep, that memory is for that VM. Now, when you're not using the VM, that memory is generally allowed back into the system for general utilization. But if you run the VM, if you're not using memory sharing, it suddenly goes, this memory is being utilized, and it will show on the resource monitor that it's gone, which again means that that memory is no longer usable for the system background services, particularly if you're running more resource intensive background file system services in the likes of ZFS. All of these things, and BTRFS in fact as well, these all mean that with virtualization use, not only do you have to provision for the additional VM space in memory, but you also have to make sure that you keep some in the background. Same goes for Plex too, often overlooked. Finally, an area that is wildly overlooked in terms of memory utilization, and overlooked until you realise you need it desperately, is surveillance. If you're running a surveillance NAS, a lot of these NAS brands will say, this CPU inside is a Celeron, a Pentium, a Core, a Xeon. It will run 25, 40, 80 cameras and more, which is great. Cameras use a lot of memory. They are visual resources, and generally when stuff is passed through, particularly AI processes I might add as well, they use a decent chunk of memory. And even though the CPU will be marketed to support a large number of cameras, these are systems where memory consumption can get very, very high, particularly if you have active read-write operations, not just triggers when a camera suddenly goes, whoops, something's been noticed. If you are running multiple cameras, and even if they're not recording 24/7 to the NAS, because you might be utilizing the NAS's own surveillance software in order to analyze the recordings on the camera, that will consume a lot of memory. And if you are running a NAS for business with VMs and surveillance inbuilt, you are going to need extreme amounts of memory. We are talking 32 gig and higher. So for me, those are the biggest consumers of memory on a system. But let's talk about the memory itself, because we do notice that with all the different NASs that are around in the market, they've all got different memory types. They've all got, some of them go SODIMM, UDIMM, DDR3, DDR4, DDR3L. What does it all mean? Well, let's break down probably the most important factors, because there are lots more factors, but when it comes down to memory, what are the key distinguishing points that you should be looking out for? First and foremost, let's be honest, DDR3, DDR4, etc., etc. This is pretty much the versioning of that memory. As you go into the higher ranks of it, the voltage dips, but the overall performance in megahertz will increase. So when you go generally, the majority of NASs in the market these days are DDR3 or DDR4. And of course, they're in the middle, DDR3L, with the L being low power there. Between those are pretty much all the ones you're going to go for. And if you bought a NAS that's been released in the last year or so, you're going to need DDR4. You can't use DDR4 inside a DDR3 system or vice versa. They are slightly different in the pins, and also the CPU won't give you the time of day on that. DDR3 and DDR3L, slightly different scenario. You can utilize those in different systems, but obviously they are backwards compatible, but you can't really take advantage of any advantage on an L, for example, with the low power on a system that's not supporting that in the CPU. Now next, there's the frequency. Now I kept saying the word power there. Most memory arrives in hundreds or thousands of megahertz. Generally, DDR3 is around 1600, DDR3L is 18, and DDR4, depending on what you go for DDR4, because it does fluctuate, it's normally 2400 megahertz or 2666 megahertz. It can go as high as over 3000, but generally in NAS, most NAS systems outside of enterprise rack mounts do not have CPUs that can support the 3200 memory from DDR4 there. Now, this megahertz thing is based on how many times that memory can be accessed per second, and obviously the higher the number, the better the performance threshold there. So again, after that, we look at the gigabytes. That's the area, let's be honest, that most people focus on more than any other. When you look at the memory module saying 1, 2, 4, etc., gigabytes, that is how much that memory can hold. These are measured in those processes, they're measured in those programs. These are things that are being held. If you're doing something on the NAS, an active process, an active application, it lives in the memory. And the more memory you have, the greater surface area and hands that can support those processes. However, there are limitations. For example, some memory some NAS devices with their CPU require you to pair the memory. Some of them aren't so particular about that, but it's still recommended that you always pair the memory. Some systems will require you to only, they'll arrive with only one slot, and that slot will generally mean that you can't exceed 8 gigabytes, at least in SODIMM. And again, it is CPU dependent, of course. But what's really interesting is when you have some NASes, such as a number of the new Synology units, that arrive with soldered memory inside. Now, when you look at the 220 or the likes of this, the 920, some very popular NASes, they arrive with 4 gig and 2 gig of memory respectively. But these two devices solder the memory to the board. It's individual chips. I believe they are Hynix or perhaps Samsung. I know we did a rip down on this device. That memory is soldered to the board, and there is one upgrade slot there. So in the case of this device, it's got an 8 gig maximum, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but you can only put one memory module in there of 4 gig. Technically, this is a limitation that we'll talk about later on. Whereas in this device, even though the CPU inside has a maximum memory utilization of 8 gig, you can only put a single 4 gig slot in there, which can be very confusing for a number of people out there in terms of upgrading the memory inside. 6 gig, 8 gig, even though the CPU family inside supports 8 gig. So do bear in mind that even though the CPU may say certain limitations and maximums, the brand may take a very different stance there, and we've talked about that in previous videos. Now, lastly, we can talk about size and configurations. Now, we talked about SODIMM pretty much exclusively here because this is what I've got on the table. But SODIMM isn't the only popular kind of memory in network attached storage today. SODIMM is the small one there, and again, I'm looking at my notes there. It is small outline memory. I can't remember everything. Occasionally, I've got to look at the notes. But then you have RDIMM and UDIMM. Now, UDIMM is unbuffered memory. This is certainly the better performing, but it's the less stable memory overall. It's generally found a little bit cheaper. It's not unstable like it's terrible, but compared with that of RDIMM, which is registered memory, which the performance is slightly lower, but it's far more stable and consistent. These are the longer sticks that you generally find everywhere, with UDIMM, once again, being by far the most affordable of the two. But the last thing we've not really talked about, something that Synology have really been championing of late, is ECC, Error Code Correction memory. And again, error code correcting, there's lots of different variations of ECC there. But ECC memory arrives, if we pull out some of these chips here, you will find that on a memory module, you have a bunch of chips on the stick there, and each one of those little modules is an area of storage. And again, depending on if it's dual rank or single rank, that means it's on either side. Now, ECC memory has an extra chip inside. That extra chip that's inside is ultimately running a checksum on all the memory. So once again, inside we've got 4 modules there. And if we remove the label on this side, you can just about make out there's 2 chips underneath that little red label, and there's an additional chip there in the middle. That additional chip is there to check all the memory passing through the memory. It does a binary line. Again, it's way too technical to go into here, but ultimately a check is done at the beginning and the end of transferring of data, and if there is a corruption or a difference between them, the memory will heal that file. That's what the error code correction does. It corrects errors that pass through the memory, which is great stuff there, and something that a lot of businesses take advantage of when they're dealing with lots of small files passing through the memory. It's a tiny extra, but certainly enterprise level users will tend to use ECC memory overall. So those are kind of the buying points of memory when you are looking at buying memory upgrades for your NAS server. You now know what memory does. You now also know all the different things you should be looking at and their priorities and their effect on their system. So now let's talk about the limitations of memory. We already touched on one of them earlier on, and that was to do with manufacturers and the CPUs. So a lot of these brands have slightly different rulings against the CPU manufacturer about the maximums. Synology is, I would argue, the most aggressive of this. They will say that their system, the CPU inside, even if Intel, say a CPU, for example, supports 128 gig or 64 gig of memory, there are numerous examples of Synology units where they go, nope, it's 32 gig maximum, stop what you're doing. Now that could be for several reasons. The first reason is physical slots. The slots inside the device, much like we described just now, there may be less slots than that CPU can potentially handle. So for example, the Xeon 1527, I believe, that's inside the DS720 XS, a quad core, that supports, I believe, up to 64 gig of DDR4 memory over 4 slots. But that NAS only has 2 slots. So therefore, it can't spread it out evenly. So the manufacturer is forced to say, no, it's less than that. Then you've got examples like these where they've soldered on the standard memory inside. And therefore, for example, in the 220, you have to have a 6 gig limit on a CPU that can do 8 gig. Now, there is also the argument that NAS brands like to sell their own memory, and this is something we have talked about before. And in some cases, people have argued that because the NAS brand doesn't have a bigger module on their portfolio, their available upgrades, therefore the brand will go, no, you have to use our memory, therefore that's your maximum. And that's something that's been discussed just on and on this channel for a long time. So again, do check. Just because you might look at the manufacturer's pages and say, but it can handle maximum, that doesn't necessarily translate into what the NAS can actually officially support. And do remember, by exceeding those limitations, something we're going to end the video on here, that there is every chance that you're putting your NAS into a configuration that the brands won't support. And again, you've seen me do lots of memory upgrade videos on this channel. You know my thoughts and feelings on this, but it still never hurts to remind you that if you are running an unsupported configuration, there's every possibility the brand will not support you. So do bear that in mind. Now, we talk about exceeding limits. That's something we've, again, covered many times with upgrading these devices. So let's talk about the consequences of that. Let's talk about if you upgrade a NAS beyond the recommended maximums, what can happen? Because there is no one thing that can happen. If you look at this device, this is the DS920, we have stuck a 16 gig module inside that single slot, and DSM has shown us 20 gig, 20 GB of usable memory. Now, the key word there is usable, because if you upgrade the memory in different devices, one of the following 4 things may occur. So you have to bear that in mind before you buy any memory upgrades, either of an unofficial brand, so most of the brands are slightly iffy about using, say, Crucial or Samsung or Timetech or any of these different brands. So the first thing that might happen is the NAS just flat out won't boot. It just will not boot at all. We did that in previous testing when we stuck a 32 gig inside this. We exceeded that and the memory just went, no way. Often that can be because the individual memory modules, the SD-RAM on those chips there were larger than the individual they could be. So when we talk about dual rank and single rank modules, the reason that's important is often the CPU inside these devices will not see chips inside that are too large. So when you get a dual rank and it's an 8 gig or a 16 gig module, there's lots more smaller chips that the CPU can deal with. On a single rank module, you have fewer chips inside, and each one of those chips will be larger in quantity. So for example, this 16 gig module here is dual rank. There are 8 chips on either side. Each chip is 1 gig. You add them all up, it's 16. But if that was a dual rank module, that memory module there would only have 8 chips there on one side, but each one will be 2 gig. And as you go into the larger capacities, those chips get larger, and that's what forces the NAS not to boot. The memory module areas are too large, and therefore it's like, no, can't use it. There's no memory in this system. Kaputski. So do bear that in mind. Second thing that might happen when you install memory that exceeds the recommended maximum, or unofficial memory as well, is that the system will work, but it will be unstable. And by that I mean there will be the odd graphical hiccup. Or worse still, that you'll be running processes and the system will drop. It will just drop from time to time. You're in the middle of a process and whoop, system reboots, app reboots, whoop, system hangs. You're in the browser, what's going on? And the page has to refresh and start over. These little memory hiccups can come from exceeding official memory at times, and they can also happen because of the instability of that memory. So do bear that in mind. And again, there's every chance that it won't happen, but there's also every chance that it might. The third one, while I look at my notes there, is the system will show you the memory. You'll go into the resource monitor and it'll go, well done, you've got a crap load of memory in this system. Or you'll go into it and it will go, congratulations, we can see all of this memory in the individual apps, surveillance, VMs, etc. But you can't actually use it. And in some cases, you'll try to use it, you'll do a process that exceeds, so for example, again, using this as an example, it has an 8 gig official maximum memory. So you'll do a process that takes advantage of 12 gig and you've stuck a larger memory module inside. That's when you know the system will go, oh, no, we can't do it. And the system will hang, the system will reboot, or it will basically just stop and you're forced to reboot. That's one of the areas where it will show you that the memory is visible but not usable. They're very different things because the CPU is just not able to run a process larger than that memory quantity, or that it runs it, and that's where the instability can come in. Now, the fourth outcome is everything's fine, because that does happen too. As I mentioned before, sometimes the NAS brands use a CPU that can support larger memory quantities than that listed by the manufacturer via limitations of their own physical slots, by limitations of their own available memory upgrades and stuff like that. Now, in those scenarios, everything's fine. I've run several NASs like that. The 1621 XS Plus is a great example of that. The DS3617 XS. These are NASs I've put unofficial, exceeded the recommended manufacturer, brand maximum, and they've run fine. They've run because the CPU is capable of handling that. However, by doing that, again, you are running an unsupported configuration. So the fourth instance you have to bear in mind is you may be knackering that warranty utilization for yourself. You might not be able to take advantage of it. So do bear in mind, even in the perfect scenario, there is always going to be that factor. And although I do recommend having as much memory as possible inside your NAS to run the very best apps and services, you've got to bear those 4 points in mind. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you've enjoyed that. I know this has been a bit boring, this video, compared to the ones of the last few weeks, but it is important, and I think it's something a lot of NAS users need to wrap their head around. Thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you want to learn more about this subject. And of course, if you are looking to buy your first NAS or upgrading an old one, use the free advice section on NAS Compares. It is legit free. Go down there. It's just fill out a few boxes. You don't even have to give that much info. You just chuck it in there and you go, right, this is what I need. What do you recommend? It's only manned by myself and Eddie, the web guy. It might take an extra day or so to answer your query because it is just the pair of us, but we'll give you unbiased, helpful answers. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.